strengthening of the eastern flank, and leads the battle group in Estonia, for example, conducts naval deployments in Baltic Sea and Northern Sea exercises. In the south, participates in air policing mission in Romania, naval deployments in Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So we see already a kind of response in this domain. Of course, the resilience is a key word as well, building the resilience within the UK, but also helping the partners and allies to build the resilience. So in the societies that are targeted by Russian malign influences. And for example, Ukraine is mentioned in the document, that UK will ensure that this kind of support to Ukraine to build its armed forces. So UK is also mentioned in the context of being a force for good and defending democracy and human rights. This is probably a clear relation to Russia as well, because UK has adopted Magnitsky-style global sanctions regime and has applied it in relation to Russia, and so to against those who are involved in the great human rights violations. And it will launch the second global sanctions regime on corruption to prevent the channeling of money through the UK financial system. So to sum up, there is, I believe, a realization that this is that UK-Russia confrontation is a new normalcy. One needs to get accustomed to, unless the Russian approach changes and unless Russia starts to abide, its behavior starts to abide by international law. No full-fledged normalization is possible and feasible. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, perhaps I could also now turn to the other major state actor identified in the integrated review for the UK, and that's China. In the build-up to the release of the integrated review, much was made of the need for the UK to get tough with China, and the whole tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which was heavily trailed ahead of the launch of the IR, including, of course, the deployment of the UK carrier group to the region this year, was seen as a kind of signal of UK intent, in particular towards China. Virila, some have been critical of the China position in the integrated review, arguing the UK is looking too accommodating. Do you think the government has got it right regarding China in the document?
It's interesting, Neil. I think in some corners of government here, or at least in Parliament, I should say, I think there are some voices of displeasure that this has not gone far enough. But I think it's quite interesting. You know, the UK has taken in this integrated review a more realistic approach to China. China is a reality that the UK has to deal with. It is a country and a power that is here to stay. And the UK has to find a way to engage with that, not just on global challenges, which it has mentioned, but also and chiefly on the economy. So, you know, China is the second largest economy in the world. It might become the first. It bounced back from COVID well. But the UK, of course, does say at the same time that China, you know, presents a systemic challenge in today's geopolitical landscape. It is the chief state-based economic competitor to the UK and threat to the UK. So that is a very difficult balance to strike. But to be honest, that's not really new. So, you know, I think we have to bear in mind that whilst, you know, there is perhaps some disappointment around the tone, I think we have to, you know, be clear and make no mistake that this is a different turn and a different take from the days of the golden era. This is not simply engagement with no understanding or no awareness of the challenges that entails. Indeed, you know, the UK has been vocal so far on issues and taking the leadership even on issues like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. It is noted in the integrated review that it is concerned about the South China Sea and Chinese military modernization. Now, admittedly, the details on how it exactly wants to respond to that are somewhat thin, but I guess we'll have to wait and see for the March 22 defense white paper for more details on that. But back at home, the UK is also looking to really shore up that resilience, to protect its economy through investment screening, through building a greater understanding of China, which there has been some criticism that isn't really fully fledged in the UK yet. It's looking to protect national critical infrastructure and IP. It wants to redirect and create new secure supply chains on raw materials and critical components and goods. And of course, it wants to invest in new strategic frontiers, everything from space and cyber to bioengineering and quantum mechanics, and quantum computing, I should say. But it doesn't want to just do this alone. It wants to do that in partnership with others. So I think what this does is actually bring the UK a little bit closer to the language that we're seeing coming out of the US at the moment. This idea of a multifaceted challenge and role for China in the international landscape and international geopolitical scene is something that the EU also recognizes, in that it's a competitor, a negotiating partner, and a systemic challenger. And that kind of reflects the reality of today. We'll just have to wait and see how the UK manages to balance all those different facets of China.
Thanks. I mean, alongside China, I guess the other Indo-Pacific country that sort of shines out from the integrated review is India, and India is in many ways, it seems, the rising star of UK foreign and security policy. I'd like to go to Aditya now and ask him a little bit about how he sees this. I mean, the integrated review sets out a substantive agenda for UK-India relations, and also the Prime Minister took the occasion to announce that he will travel to India next month for the delayed summit. Why would you say that India is important to the UK? And conversely, is India interested in becoming a major partner to the UK and possibly even an ally, as we've heard of this sort of possible discussion about the UK strengthening its role with the Quad?
Thank you, Neil. As you rightly sort of identify, the integrated review highlights India as a crucial UK partner over the next decade as part of its Indo-Pacific tilt, and it presents a clear attempt at trying to elevate the relationship with India. What the integrated review does is it highlights the already strong people-to-people and the research and education linkages, and it emphasizes the need for deeper economic ties. These, I think, factors partially explain the importance of India for the UK. The large Indian diaspora in the country and the size of the Indian economy mean that the relationship will always be important. And in particular, in a post-Brexit Britain, the economic logic has become even more salient, particularly as China has emerged as a strategic challenge. And the UK has looked at addressing some of India's lingering immigration-related issues. And in the context of the Prime Minister Johnson's upcoming visit to India, I think what is expected to be the key outcome of that is this announcement of an enhanced trade partnership, which is seen as a stepping stone towards a free trade agreement, which is a reflection of the importance of this relationship for both the UK and India. I think what the integrated review also highlights is that the two countries share common objectives on transnational issues, which were sort of laid out in the document. These include climate change and global health, which are sort of exemplified by the cooperation between the two sides in frameworks like the International Solar Alliance or the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which actually both prime ministers are addressing today at a conference, and on manufacturing also for the COVID-19 vaccine, which is a shared endeavor partially between the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine and the Serum Institute in India. I think in addition to this, the two countries share views on the Indian Ocean region security questions and on preserving a sort of rules-based international order, particularly as the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean are both sort of key economic channels of trade. In terms of your question and how a relationship is viewed in India, I think it's seen as similarly being quite important. The UK is an important economic partner and is a major destination for Indian students in particular. And the integrated review also, I think, effectively dehyphenates India from Pakistan and from regional security questions in UK policy thinking, which has in the past been a concern in New Delhi in terms of how the UK views the region. But there continue to be some challenges related to, I think, both the UK and India are on opposing sides of, for example, whether or not the British Indian Ocean Territory should be returned to Mauritius, for example. And there are also concerns about sort of domestic trajectory of politics in India. And there is a backlash to that in New Delhi in terms of what they see as unwarranted, for example, discussions on Indian domestic politics in British Parliament. So there are those issues, but I think largely the perception is that following cooperation on COVID, some post-Brexit clarity on UK foreign policy, and the realities sort of imposed by Chinese assertiveness will lead to a positive UK-India relationship. I would stop short of saying that this could possibly lead to an alliance of some sort, because I think India is quite hesitant and remains very hesitant to enter into anything that sort of creates security or mutual obligations in that sense. But I think a deeper partnership is certainly on the cards as of now. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'd like to turn to the last region we're looking at, with Middle East and North Africa, and to ask Anise about this. Anise, I mean, in previous decades, the Middle East has been a core issue for the UK. And of course, we've seen in recent time, of course, the various engagements around conflict and stabilization missions. The region is certainly in the integrated review, but the impression is that compared to some of these other areas, the Middle East has slipped down London's priorities. Do you think the UK should be more involved in the Middle East and North Africa, and what might be a realistic ambition for the UK in the region?
Thank you, Neil. I think your assessment is exactly right. The review talks mainly about the region in terms of trade and investment, and in terms of resilience and capacity building. So the focus is very much on prosperity and resilience. Obviously, there is a focus on security, but I think that has changed compared to the past, with the main focus being on terrorism, which obviously has been the case in the past. But I think the focus seems to be mainly on building the capacity of partners and countries in the region to secure themselves and the region. And I think my main take and my main, I would say, concern with this is it seems a bit optimistic to be able to do this in a very short span of time. We are talking less than a decade, and I know it seems like a very long time, but we are talking about very challenging issues such as countering radicalization, terrorism, cyber, and even, you know, when we are looking at the resilience agenda, inclusiveness, and general stability, these are very challenging issues to deal with and to build resilience and capacity building on. So my main question is it really possible for the UK not to be as involved as it has been in the past in terms of provision of security itself? And will it be actually able to rely on partners and countries in the region to rely on themselves and to provide security for the region, when countries in the region are fighting among themselves and are not really in a position or necessarily interested in the same kind of security concerns and priorities of the UK? Yes, it's true that the UK armed forces are not going to disappear from the MENA overnight. The contribution to the global coalition against Daesh are continuing and are likely to continue. And I think the focus on terrorism will remain. But I think there is a question about the provision of security in the long run that remains. And I think the other issue and the other concern that the integrated review raises is the focus on trade and investment, which risks to come at the expense of wanting to be a force for good. There is about 30 mentions of human rights in the document, none of which specifically linked to the MENA region. And we know that definitely the MENA region cannot be praised for its human rights record. So I think the question is, when are trade and investment going to be coming at the expense of the human rights and the agenda? And how will this clash in terms of how the UK is trying to portray itself in terms of a force for good?
Thanks. I mean, I think that's the theme running through the whole integrated review, where I mean, there is an open, I think, statement of the fact that interest and values are going to sometimes come into conflict. And I guess this is one of the big challenges in the kind of world that I described at the beginning of this complex competition and state actors. I'd like to go now just to take a round of questions on sort of Europe's collective response to some of these challenges. But before I do that, could I just remind everyone to post their questions as soon as possible? We've already got some great questions coming in, and once we've completed this round with the panel, I'll start asking those. But so please do put your questions in the Q&A box as soon as possible. So then, looking at Europe as a collective actor facing these challenges, and going back to Russia, I mean, Russia has been a defining issue in many ways for for Europe. It's its biggest neighbor. But we now have President Putin entering his third decade in office. Europe seems to be struggling to find a way forward on dealing with Russia. It's often being reactive. Just recently we were seeing with the crisis in Belarus a kind of failure to actually be able to support the popular changes. Europe has seen blindsided by developments on the ground, and again in the Karabakh conflict in the South Caucasus late last year, we saw that most clearly when the Europeans were basically marginalized in the peace process, the peace talks. So, Marina, do you see a prospect that Europe can regain initiative in its relations with Russia?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Neil, for this interesting question. I believe part of the answer is already in the question, because usually the most widely quoted reason or the underlying impediment is the lack of strategic consensus in Europe. This is probably something that is most often mentioned in Europe's relations with Russia. Of course, we see some kind of convergence of the views, and this is very important to bring it to the attention here today. Sanctions against Russia that were introduced after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and incursion in eastern Ukraine. This is a very important symbolically and in practical terms. But also there is a very pronounced difference of approaches that we see. I believe we also, talking about the EU, of course, it was not devised as a security and defense actor. It was, of course, created as a peace project. But after the end of the Cold War, it was sometimes, against its own will, pulled into the European neighborhood. So, and as you rightly mentioned, it does not look very fit for the purpose. So it needs to ensure that it rises to this occasion, to this dangerous environment, and it needs to have a very consistent approach towards the region and what it does in relation to Russia. So, of course, I mean, it's very important that EU is perceived as a geopolitical adversary by Russia in the wider European neighborhood. And creation of the Eastern Partnership in 2009, it was not perceived as a merely, a political and non-security initiative, because the center of gravitation was Brussels, and it was already perceived as a threat in Russia. And hence its response to Ukraine signing the association or being willing to sign the association agreement with the EU. So basically, Moscow perceives those activities as encroachment, not only NATO's expansion, but also EU's activities. So this is important to hold in mind. And I believe that what is important, and of course nobody wants to cripple Russia. This is already in reaction to one of the questions that I see in the chat. So what should be this approach? What we need to do to regain the initiative in relations with Russia? To start with, I believe, to avoid the bad moves. There were certain bad moves already, something that I would agree with some experts, that the project of the Nord Stream 2 is a bad move. Also some other things, like, for example, unilateral advances to Russia that are not basically strengthened by its reciprocal actions, readmitting the Russian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe without it meeting basically the requirements that were asked. And also creating the system of enablers. Russia report prepared by the Intelligence Security Committee of British Parliament calls it the system of enablers. So every state must address this problem of the system of enablers, the actors that advance and transmit the Russian influence. So it's very important to raise the costs for the wrongdoings where it's needed, while of course we understand the dialogue, channels for normalization. It should be open if Russia decides to go back on track. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. And it's a similar question in a way about China. We've got a moment in which it seems like everyone in Europe wants to be in the Indo-Pacific. We saw the UK tilt announced yesterday. We've already had strategies from France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The EU is apparently modeling its own Indo-Pacific strategy. But as with Russia, Europe seems quite divided on how to approach China within the Indo-Pacific context. Some seem to be keen on balancing between China and the US and sort of leveraging the Europe's role in that context, while others view China as a clear threat. So if I turn to Vera, do you think Europe can develop a strategic and coherent approach to the Indo-Pacific region and to China in that context in particular?
I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. And I kind of do want to separate, the Indo-Pacific from China in a way. They're deeply interrelated, but the Indo-Pacific is not simply about one's approach to China. So it is about more than that. And I think there are an immense amount of commonalities between the European statements that we've seen so far and approaches to the Indo-Pacific. And there we can talk about, shared values and principles. We can talk about trying to uphold the rules-based international order, about underscoring and strengthening free trade and the digital economy, sustainability infrastructure, and also global challenges that numerous panelists have already mentioned. So I won't go into them, but there are, even just within the Indo-Pacific, differences there between European approaches. There's different emphases on geographic subregions in the Indo-Pacific. This, I might add, is not necessarily a problem. That might actually work to the benefit of finding a European approach to the Indo-Pacific, whereby countries really focus in and hone in on areas where they have a natural engagement already, where they have strengths and assets in place. Secondly, I think one area in which they can also cooperate and that will facilitate a European approach is the fact that they share many of the same partners in the region. Again, that's a framework that you can build on to try and coordinate some of these engagements. There are different capabilities. So again, trying to add value where you already have strengths. And I would say that the integrated review really kind of emphasizes that point. But whilst there is, I think, more of an emphasis on working with specific European countries, notably through an E3 engagement by the UK in the integrated review. I think it's interesting that at the same time, it did have a little bit less of an enthusiasm, I would say, for working with the EU as such. It wasn't as explicitly stated, it was more vague. And there is a potential for some areas of competition as well. I mean, I would just point to the fact that the UK has said that it will work towards establishing, quote unquote, a greater and more persistent presence than any other European country in the Indo-Pacific. So clearly there's a little bit of rivalry there as well in the 10-year kind of time span that we're looking at. But the foundations for cooperation are there, and it's really about European countries coming together to see the bigger picture in what cooperation can bring. Now, on China specifically, as I said, the integrated review kind of brings the language closer towards that of the EU already and key European states. On trade and investment, I would say that actually it kind of mirrors what Europe is doing too. Europe has already signed a preliminary framework for the investment agreement. And I would actually say that whilst the UK really emphasizes the economic relationship with China, it didn't actually say that it outright is seeking to sign an FTA with China just yet. So there, I think the UK is taking a little bit more of a realistic approach or a cautious approach. On multilateralism, there are areas in which European countries and the UK can work together. One, in issuing statements on areas and issues of concern, be that human rights in Xinjiang, for example, or Hong Kong. Secondly, within multilateral organizations, European countries could come together to really pursue and promote norms that are less aligned with those that China is pursuing in those international frameworks. And thirdly, within Indo-Pacific regional organizations, I think there's an opportunity there to really engage and enhance and invest in those existing frameworks, which many of these statements by European countries and the framework of the integrated review for the Indo-Pacific specifically have already underscored. So there's a lot of similarities there. And I think it's encouraging to see that there isn't necessarily a diverse approach of trying to reinvent the wheel and take leadership in trying to establish new organizations or new initiatives necessarily that might duplicate and dilute existing regional architecture. So again, there, commonality for working with regional partners on issues which inherently will touch upon the challenges that China present to the region. And then finally, maybe in security terms, they already, of course, share the arms embargo in China. That won't change. We see that there are, I think there should be growing communication between the UK and individual European partners, as well as the EU, on the kind of challenges that China presents and the responses that countries are taking towards that to mitigate them. But then finally, there's also real cooperation possible at sea, for example. And we see that already with the HMS Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group, in which the Netherlands and France will participate when it does go into the Indo-Pacific. So I think, whilst there are divergences, both vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific and China, there are, I think, a great number of areas where cooperation is possible and more coherence is, I think, a realistic, it is realistic to try and build on that over the next 10 years.
Thanks, Stuart. I mean, one of your points there about European rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, of course, this is very much taking place around India, where we see everyone wants to be India's best friend these days. And this, of course, hinges on the fact that for the Indo-Pacific concept to work, India has to play this pivotal role. So if I could go now to Aditya and ask you a bit about how India looks upon this rush of interest in building relations with India from the European side, and what are the opportunities in that partnership, but also what are the risks for Europe in trying to build this relationship with India?
Thanks, Neil. So I think one of the fascinating points of this relationship is also the emergence of sort of strategic autonomy within European policy thinking. I think that's something that India was sort of criticized for a while previously, but now it's being adopted more and more across the world. But I think I'd echo a few points that Virla's also made before. But to start, I'd say the overarching drivers, I think, behind the relationship are similar to what's in the UK-India relationship. For example, the economic leg of the relationship is crucial with the EU-India relationship. The EU is one of India's largest trading partners. And I think an economic agreement of some sort will probably be one of the priorities in the coming future. And I think it's probably a point I should have mentioned in the UK question as well, but one of the key drivers of engagement here is also going to be on decoupling and supply chain diversification, something that we'll also mention, particularly around questions on 5G and on sort of critical technologies. In this sense, India is attempting to implement measures to attract investment in its domestic markets, but it remains to be seen how successful this is and whether European companies actually engage with this. India has also engaged in a supply chain resilience initiative with Japan and Australia, and there's potential for engagement with these sort of structures as well. In terms of the risks for the economic relationship, I think striking a free trade agreement or a trade deal with India has been sort of notoriously difficult historically, particularly in the EU as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the near future. The Indian government does say that it is doing things differently, but I mean, we've heard some of those things before. I think one of the rising challenges is the growing protectionism within India in terms of its market liberalization policies, its imposition of tariffs on certain imports, etc. And that might hamper how the EU-India relationship moves forward economically. But I think an important change that's happened in the last sort of year and a half has been the shift to a broader geopolitical strategic discussion on the EU-India relationship, which was previously largely restricted to economics. And yes, I mean, it's undeniable that sort of the Chinese assertiveness, both on India's borders and more broadly, has driven the two sides closer in this regard. And there is a view, at least in Delhi, that actions and policies of China are having a negative impact on the Indian Ocean region and sort of the sea lane communication, etc. And that there is a need for middle powers, for example, like the EU and India, to come together to cooperate on issues that they see as important mutually, like climate change, rules-based international order, and international law. And I think with the increasing Indo-Pacific initiatives of European states, there is a growing emphasis on multilateral and minilateral partnerships within the Indo-Pacific, and more specifically in the Indian Ocean region when it comes to India. And I think within that, to highlight just a couple, I'd say France is an important security partner for India. It has been for a while. It is a key source of defense equipment, fighter aircraft and submarines, sort of key equipment. And it is becoming increasingly engaged as a partner in the Indo-Pacific through sort of trilaterals with India and other countries like Australia, or through a logistics agreement it struck with India a couple of years ago. And I mean, I think most recently we've seen reports of a potential naval exercise with the Quad countries and the UAE and France coming up in the next month. So I think there are sort of key security engagements as well. Now, when it comes to Germany, for example, as a second example, there is a growing, I think its Indo-Pacific document was important and interesting in the sense that it laid more emphasis on economic engagement and multilateralism in that sense. And this, just referencing back to Virla's point on European countries also working within existing multilateral organizations. So I think the German Indo-Pacific document specifically mentioned organizations and institutions like BIMSTEC, so the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, very complicated, and the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which are both sort of important multilateral groupings for India. So I think there are these sort of opportunities for the two sides to work together in these frameworks. I don't see any particular major risk in terms of this strategic engagement between the EU and India. Obviously, there is the broader concern that is there in much of the Western world at the moment about, again, calling back to sort of the domestic political trajectory within India. And if sort of the human rights agenda comes into it from the European perspective, that might put a dampener on EU-India relations going forward. But I'm not necessarily convinced that that is going to happen. I believe that it's going to be a lot more pragmatic, and the relationship is going to be a lot more focused on sort of geopolitical realities. Thank you.
Okay, and then turning to the Middle East as our final case study, really, of Europe as an actor. I mean, for decades, Europe has been the leading voice in many ways, alongside the Americans, on shaping developments in the Middle East. Today, we see something quite different happening across the region. Europe seems to have lost its sense of how to engage, and even what its strategic vision is of the Middle East. And in place of that, we see Middle East powers, Turkey and the Gulf countries, increasingly seeming to actually set the agenda in places like the East Med and North Africa. So Anise, do you think Europe can rebuild a role in the Middle East, and what would it take for such a change to happen?
Thanks, Ian. I mean, it's a great question. And I think to the last part of your question, what will it take? I mean, for me, it's, if not now, then when? There are prospects of the US retrenching from the region, combined with what we just discussed about the UK and the potential role of the UK in the MENA moving forward, also based on the integrated review. The risk is a very significant vacuum created because of both trends and in terms of security, especially because Europe is such a crucial factor in security across Europe. I think that is something that needs to be considered carefully. And combined with what you rightly described as the policy of several countries in the region being more active and trying to set the agenda, I think this often comes at the expense of Europe's own interests and security concerns. So I think really it's now the time for Europe to start thinking hard about whether it wants to have a role, and actually not if it wants, but how. I think it is really a necessity for Europe to rebuild its role in the Middle East. It's obviously challenging. I'm not saying that it's easy, and especially when it comes to the security agenda, the provision of security, hard power, this is particularly complicated. As Aditya has mentioned, there has been a lot of talks about strategic autonomy. We still don't exactly know what that means in practice, let alone knowing whether that could translate into operational autonomy when it comes to hard power and security. So obviously the challenge is significant, but on the diplomatic sphere, there are already things that Europe can be doing. I think generally speaking, there should be a stronger reliance on flexible formats, on small groups, on bilateral engagement, and basically on interested and countries that have the available resources and the interest in specific issues to take the lead. If Europe continues to wait for multilateral formats for the whole of Europe to take one single agenda forward, we know that that often translates in stalemate, and I think that's not sustainable in the long run.
Thank you, Nise, and thank you to all the panel. I think you've a lot of thought-provoking contributions, and now I'd like to turn to some of the questions. And I could begin perhaps with trying to group some of the questions about Russia. So this is a question, I think, primarily to Marina, and it's coming from Wolfgang Helper, Bill McCulloch, and Roger Higginson. And I think it's really a set of issues here, which is in looking at Russia from the European side, we've struggled to understand to where it's going and what is the ultimate sort of outcome, and then how to tailor our responses to it. So the question really is, looking ahead, what are the strategic challenges that Russia's likely to do? I mean, someone's even said, is there a risk that Russia itself, after Putin, may sort of disintegrate in the way that the Soviet Union did? But also concretely looking at places like the Donbass and other areas of the former Soviet Union. Do Europe, in the form of the EU and NATO, need to find ways to work much more closely together to what one of the questioners calls a Schröderization of Europe, I think meaning an accommodation of Russia step by step? And what does that look like in terms of actually the kind of relationship that the EU and NATO should have? And then just to give a heads up, perhaps I'll come to Vera next, where we have a question about, and possibly Aditya, about whether Europe can work together on maritime security more effectively. Yeah. Over to you, Marina.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience who asked the questions. And I believe one of the unifying messages here was, how do we respond not to antagonize Russia unnecessarily, and to have this unified position on Russia, concerted efforts, also bringing together NATO and EU. So I believe this is a very right direction that we need to be thinking about. Having Europe a more, let's say, pronounced security profile in the region. This is a very correct thing to do. I said that probably not everybody feels up to this challenge, because this is a really serious challenge. Somebody would call it a dangerous brinkmanship, that it's antagonizing Russia, who poses already a serious threat, because we do not know what to expect. But I would argue, and I would agree with the experts who argue, that a toothless or meek approach to Russian threat might be even more dangerous. And it already proved that it bore no fruits. Those kind of advances when Russia was approached, but no normalization followed. We see this already. So I believe that these kind of efforts really need to be concerted. And one of the questions was asked primarily about what to do, how about the security compacts in the European neighborhood. I think this is very important to understand, that this is the region where UK, NATO as an alliance, EU as a supranational organization have very serious interests at stake. Of course, it's very important to understand that this is not the only priority at the moment. There are many other priorities, and the variety of opinions and this panel today, the variety of actors we look at, is a testimony to this theme, that we have a rise in China. So we have many other challenges, but I believe this is a very, this is a very close neighborhood, and it's very important to have a more concerted policy on this, and to bring actors together, as I said.
Okay, thank you. And then turning to Viral, I mean, we've got this, obviously the carrier strike group, the UK one deploying, the French are already sort of on their way to the region. There's a lot of activity around the Gulf and European naval forces. So I think the question here is this interest, this growing interest on maritime security, is this an area where Europe can actually drive forward more systematic cooperation?
Sure. I mean, maybe just a quick clarification on my previous answer because I misspoke. Of course, the Netherlands will join the QE carrier strike group to the Indo-Pacific, but not France. I meant the US. But France is present militarily in the region, of course, and particularly in the maritime domain. So look, as a short answer to your question, yes, they can cooperate, and yes, they should cooperate. There are reasons for this. They share, I think, a great number of concerns around, maritime choke points, around trade, the trade flows and freedom of navigation and stability of that at sea, and also the kind of environmental impacts of some of the activities that are taking place in the maritime domain. So there's a whole host of areas where they can agree they share concern. There's also a whole host of areas where they agree capacity building can be done, whether that be on maritime domain awareness, whether that be on, educating on maritime crime like illegal fishing, whether that be on promoting and giving more training on international maritime law. So there's a lot of different areas in which they can cooperate as well in these shared concerns, and there are ways forward on that. But I would say, of course, there's also the realistic realistic limitation that we all have limitations on our resources, and the countries in the region also have a limitation in how much they can absorb. So when it comes to, individually targeting and individually providing, engagement in the maritime security domain, that's all well and good, but you might overburden and you might duplicate efforts in that region. So might not get the intended impact that you seek. So it would be better to cooperate. But as always, things are less straightforward than that. So, there is, I think, some level of competition or maybe a feeling of slight protectionism over that, some of these initiatives are wholly EU initiatives, or maybe they're UK-led initiatives. For example, when it comes to MDA, so maritime domain awareness capacity building, the EU has expanded its Crimario program from the Western Indian Ocean region to now include Southeast Asia, and clearly has a lot of ambition there to work with specific Southeast Asian partners and partners within the Indo-Pacific on maritime domain awareness capacity building. And it's not clear yet to what extent the UK could be involved or could coordinate its own efforts in that sense. And again, as I mentioned, when it comes to being actually present at sea, obviously the Netherlands has already indicated that it will join the UK in the Indo-Pacific, in the maritime domain, but it's less clear to what extent other European countries at this point in time are going to do so. But I'll let Aditya also add on to that.
Okay, Aditya, before you turn to that question, I think there's also a couple of questions for you that you could perhaps respond to. One is, which is about what should be done on Burma. And I asked you that because, of course, I see that India, certainly in the UN context, has had a distinct position on Burma, along with Russia and China. But then there's also a question about the Quad from Frederici Larusso, who says, India has never been too keen on the Quad. Is this going to change in the future?
Thanks, Neil. On the maritime security bit, I think I just echo everything Verla said. I think she's covered largely most of everything. But to turn to the Burma question, this is an extremely complicated situation in the region, for example, because I think the problem is that Western countries who do seem to have a more proactive human rights position on this do not have as much leverage as they would like to impose sort of policy changes in the country. And the countries in the region have a slightly more nuanced position in terms of their relationship with both the military and the potential sort of calculations that they make about what their stance on the current situation in Myanmar might lead to in terms of the Chinese Chinese engagement and sort of strategic influence in the country. So that's particularly the Indian stance as well, is that India has a sort of strong security partnership with the Tatmadaw. It has conducted sort of counterinsurgency operations along the shared borders along Northeast India. And sort of there is a calculation in New Delhi that if it does things to sort of antagonize the military at this point in time, it will lead to a situation where China can expand its strategic influence. And given the current situation between India and China in terms of their relationship, that's something that India doesn't see as desirable. Turning to the question on the Quad, yeah, I mean, India was reluctant in the past, but I think this is changing. There was a leader level summit last week, and then before that, we'd seen a foreign ministers level meeting a few months ago. So there is a marked sort of elevation of that framework. I think there's also something that's helped is also there's been a concerted effort by all of the countries to try and distance the Quad from its sort of association, at least in sort of media and public opinion, with sort of being a military or a hard security partnership. And I think the outcomes of the last leader level summit, especially in terms of the vaccine diplomacy and the vaccine partnerships, and those sort of agreements are, and sort of creation of working groups around technology and other such non-hard security questions are crucial to sort of keeping this relationship, in moving forward, essentially. Obviously, I think currently, given all of the countries have a sort of a difficult relationship with China at the moment, makes this not an extremely difficult decision for the countries involved. But I think what will be interesting to see is if at any point in time in the future, relationships between sort of India and China or Australia and China do improve to any certain extent, what that means for the Quad, whether that impacts the trajectory of the Quad at all. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. And then a couple of questions for Anise. The first one, I think, coming out of your comments about the tension between interests and values in UK position. And so Madeleine Moon writes, is this review, the IR, simply a reflection of the inevitability of a post-Brexit Britain needing to focus on trade and investment, reduce its focus on human rights, and build a defence and foreign policy with an economic policy focus? Secondly, I think one which is looking at more on the regional issues that you touched upon in your presentation. This is from Marius Porcelidis, who says, do any of the commentators see Turkey becoming a failed state and a threat similar to Iran in the international order? And perhaps if you could answer that, Anise, and then we could perhaps turn across the panel for those interested in responding to this broader question, which I think touches on one of the issues running through all of our discussion. This is a question from Tim Dowse, which is, his question is, the renewed interest in European strategic autonomy was a reaction to the policies of the Trump administration. With the arrival of President Biden, will the steam go out of this concept, or is it here to stay? And so obviously this is, I think, a reflection about the question that we're all trying to look at in today's discussion about the future role of Europe. But first to you, Anise.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, all very good questions, I have to say. I'll start with Madeleine's question. I think, yeah, that was really the expectation that trade and investment would be the dominant factor in a post-Brexit global Britain kind of agenda. I think what we have been stressing throughout the discussion, and specifically, I think when it comes to the MENA region, is this clash between the UK trying to portray itself as a force for good and also focusing on investment and trade. I think more clarity on what that will mean when there are these clashes would be helpful. Does it mean there will be a conditionality, say, for countries that are human rights abuser, and that that would create for the UK some sort of prioritization in terms of dealing with those that are implementing a human rights focus agenda, that are promoting inclusiveness, education for women, all these other issues that have been raised throughout the integrated review. It's not clear to me when there is a clash between these two, which one is going to be dominating. I mean, it's clear it's likely to be trade and investment, but then that clashes with the whole image that the UK is trying to portray of itself. So I think that is the kind of message that I wanted to deliver. On Turkey, I think really it depends on who you ask. That is, one of the issue on which I think there is no a consistent view across Europe, starting with the UK. We know that the UK has a very different position and view towards Turkey compared to several of the other European countries. I think failed state is probably a very strong term. I wouldn't say that that is the right term, but in terms of the threat to the international order, certainly there are several European countries that perceive that to be the case, especially in some of the files that have been dominating the Mediterranean agenda, specifically when it comes to the East Med and even Libya. So I think there is going to be increasing concern on what Turkey is going to be doing, especially given the growing activism that Turkey has been having in terms of foreign policy, and it is likely to set the agenda moving forward, especially coming to elections and Erdogan's broader ambitions in foreign policy. So definitely it's something that needs to be watched, but for several countries, including the UK, there is no comparison between the threat that Iran is perceived to pose to the international order compared to Turkey, and that has been very well reflected into the integrated review. I would expand on that, but I'm afraid that we are running out of time. I would also quickly say one word on the strategic autonomy. Will it stay? I don't know. I think it's a very good question. I think the way in which the question has been phrased in terms of this has been emerging as something as a reaction to the Trump administration. It's exactly right. There might be a tendency to simply relax and not think about strategic autonomy because now the transatlantic agenda is again back in order on several issues. But I think if Europe is smart, they should look ahead and look in 4 years' time. There is again the possibility that a presidency in the US will have divergent ambitions, divergent priorities in security terms, especially in the Middle East, but also in the broader discussion that we have had up until now. So I think strategic autonomy, if not for now, should definitely be a priority for Europe moving forward, because there is a risk of transatlantic issues not being aligned again. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know whether anyone else has any views on strategic autonomy, whether you have to wave at me because I can't see you, but I know, I mean, obviously, perhaps I could ask you, Marina, about this, because this, it's also been an issue that, of course, has divided Europe. Often the countries on the east dealing with Russia as direct neighbor have been far less keen on the strategic autonomy angle and much keener on renewing transatlantic systems. So do you find this strategic autonomy discussion helpful in thinking about how to manage Russia?
Yeah, I believe there is a number of approaches to these issues, as you rightly mentioned. So, of course, I mean, after the elections in the US, of course, there was a palpable feeling of relief that US is back as a credible partner. And this is something that does not, as the question asks, does this let this team out of this concept? And that doesn't mean that it's not irrelevant. It's not relevant any longer. I believe this concept is relevant, but the delicate balance needs to be striking in the sense that there are sensitivities, very serious sensitivities involved, as you rightly mentioned, because for many countries, they want to see NATO as a primary security and defense actor in the region. So they don't want to see some kind of duplications, or they don't want to see EU, let's say, taking the resources from NATO as being as a major security actor. So there is serious, let's say, gaps in the perceptions. And I believe when we talk about strategic autonomy, let us say this does not mean that EU should not strive to become, to have a higher, more profound security profile in the region. I'm talking about Russia and the Eastern Partnership countries, for example. So this means that, of course, those national sensitivities involved should be addressed. But I believe that this, the idea of strategic autonomy is a very serious and it needs to be addressed.
Thanks. Unfortunately, with that, we've run out of time, and we're just getting into the strategic autonomy discussion, which of course can go on for many hours. I hope that everyone in the audience has found the discussion today useful. I mean, I certainly think that the panel has highlighted some key issues, and I think one of them, which also runs through the integrated review, is that global Britain to function is also going to require a global Europe. Is that we can't see the two as being separate, and whether it's framed as strategic autonomy or the transatlantic relationship, nonetheless, Europe as a whole is going to have to step up if it's going to play a global role and to assert a more strategic agenda in many of the regions that we've been covering here. And this, I guess, is a conversation that we would like to come back to in our team. We see that, of course, again, in the integrated review, there's a certain skating over of the UK's future relationship, particularly to the EU, a clear assertion of UK commitment for NATO, but how it's going to work with the wider European community is going to be a key question for the UK going forward. And we'll certainly come back to that. And my apologies to all of you who posed questions that we didn't get to. Please do rejoin us and ask your questions again next time. Many of them, I think, are eternal questions that we're dealing with on the European side. But also, I'd just like to reiterate to sign up to the newsletter or follow us at ISS_RUSI for Twitter information about our future activities. But for now, goodbye from London.